Sounds great. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everyone, for joining today, sharing your time with us here at UW-Madison. And as Scott shared, I am a regional crops and soils educator, and I was told when I moved over to this area east from where I was working that there wouldn't be any alfalfa grown, which I found is not the case. So we will have some opportunities to work on forages here in the south central part of the state as well. Um, so I just want to kind of lay some groundwork here to begin with. What are we thinking about here today? And it really is, we're trying to meet that goal of successful alfalfa establishment. All right, and there's different ways to get there. We're going to highlight a practice today where we're direct seeding alfalfa into a cereal rye cover crop. So we're planting that cereal rye the fall before alfalfa establishment, and then we're coming back early spring and direct seeding alfalfa into that living rye. But how do we measure whether that was a successful alfalfa stand? It really comes down to the amount of plants that we have in the field come fall and then into that next full harvest year. So we need to hit that 55 stems, that stem density per square foot, kind of come fall, and that'll set us up, so we can have that 100% yield uh, potential in our alfalfa stand. So can we get there with planting alfalfa into cereal rye? I'm going to say that we can. So the picture that you see on this slide is a cross section across one of our on-farm trials in southern Wisconsin. So across this trial that you're viewing is four replicates of six different treatments, and it is nearly impossible to see where those treatment lines are come fall, of that establishment year. So planting alfalfa green, this is what we can expect early. Those small alfalfa plants, starting to germinate kind of in the protection of that cereal rye canopy, to help with some of the tough spring weather that we might have, but also to protect the soil. That really is one of the areas I want to build out in our talk today is, what can we expect from a soil health type standpoint with basically having our companion crop growing, in the field ahead of alfalfa planting. So here's a few best management practices, not that uncommon or different from just seeding alfalfa in general. But I did think it was important, through conversations with growers that are trying this practice, through the work that myself and Dan Smith did at Lancaster and at the on-farm plot in Belmont. I just wanted to share some of these best management practices. So be thinking about that field the fall ahead, which fields are scheduled for an alfalfa rotation? And do we have the soil for fertility, the soil pH, and do we have a soil surface that we want to drive across for the next, 3 to 4 or maybe 5 years? And then, go ahead and seed that cereal rye. This is a loose recommendation. It depends on what your goals are, right? But that 1 to 1.5 bushels per acre, we have not been able to break that system. So we've been able to successfully establish alfalfa, into that type of rye density again and again across the fields that we've been trialing this on. So if you're looking, for maybe having that cereal rye as a forage crop, maybe, a little bit higher, that 1.5 bushels per acre. If you're just wanting that out there as a cover crop, maybe that bushel or even a little bit less would be sufficient. And then come spring, go ahead and prepare your drill. That is a really important part for seeding any crop, especially seeding alfalfa. Get your establishment depth, or excuse me, adjust the depth and calibrate, to whatever that target pure live seed is per acre. I'm going to say you could go out and seed, as soon as the soil is fit. A little bit of a general term, but when the moistures are right and the carrying capacity of the soil is right, we can go out and seed oftentimes in early April. So the stage of the rye is not that important. It's when the soil is right to get out there and seed. And then also, that we're not putting our new alfalfa investment at risk as well. And then we'll want to manage that cereal rye. So one of the more popular ways is to use a forage harvest, either at boot stage or early thesis stage. So that's when that cereal rye head is starting to open up, and you can see some of those yellow anthers on. Oftentimes, that is maybe a little bit too late for a higher quality forage. But we do see that we have a little bit more of a termination quality. We're able to use that harvest and really terminate that rye a little more successfully when we're pushing that anthesis stage compared to boot. Chemical termination is another option. Kind of at that 3 to 4 trifoliate leaf stage, and we haven't really studied that in interaction all that well. We've just kind of tried to keep that part of the trial consistent. If we're not going to harvest that rye as a forage, what is the right time to try to terminate that? And then think about the herbicides that we're using and make sure that the weather conditions are adequate at the time that we're going to apply as well. Um, Glyphosate has been one of the more common herbicides that we have used in the trial. There may be a few other options depending on the type of seed that you're going to be planting. There's a look at that alfalfa plant as a reminder at like that third trifoliate growth stage. Okay, just a couple of views here once we get this established. This is what you can expect at the time of that forage rye harvest. We've been recommending that people keep that cutting height maybe just a tick higher, above those smaller plants when you take that forage rye harvest off. But again, we have not nuanced or teased out all these little small uh, pieces of this system. We've just been trying to keep some things consistent while we're looking at some other types of treatments that farmers are interested in. And there is that alfalfa regrowth following the first alfalfa harvest. Okay, so we harvested off a crop of cereal rye and now harvested off the first crop of alfalfa after that. So we're probably looking at around the 4th of July when these pictures were taken. And then that view at the end of the year, this is again across that same field with all the different treatments in it, and it really is remarkable how good that stand is by the end of the year. Okay, why might we want to even consider planting alfalfa green? I'm going to say one of the biggest risks and one of the tools or one of the outcomes that we can have is really reducing that risk of soil erosion and nutrient loss. So this is a picture I took in 2024. Unfortunately, I know exactly where this was at, and this was just tremendous loss on this field. We did not have a plot in this field to see what the difference was, but I'm putting this picture out there as a risk of what could happen. If we get that nice alfalfa field established with that a nice mellow soil in the spring, and then we get a really heavy rainfall or even a series of days when we have a lot of rain that falls, and the soil just cannot handle that alone. Another thing that growers are noticing and commenting on is that uh, carrying capacity of the soil. So you can see a couple of tracks there. One is a large forage harvester. One is a tractor pulled 24-ton wagon, and the soil is holding up. I'm going to attribute that a lot to the fact that we have some strong soil aggregate stability. We had that growing root from that cereal rye plant. So there's some value there too for not putting ruts in that new alfalfa field and not damaging those valuable seedling plants. Maybe a more obvious one is we have that opportunity to harvest that spring forage, oftentimes pretty early, right? By the middle to end of May, we can have a fairly high quality forage available to harvest to feed livestock. Another one we've seen in some of our row crops, but it works in this system as well, as we have that cereal rye plant intercepting sunlight and keeping some of those weed seeds from germinating early, and getting into our stand. We don't maybe have a huge risk of stand loss or such, but we do have a difference in quality, if we're able to keep the weeds at bay and try to grow more alfalfa in our field. All right, so a little bit deeper dive into that soil health or that soil quality piece of this. We had three different treatments that we looked at the Lancaster Ag Research Station. This was in 2023. Planted green no-till and this cultimulch till, so maybe more of a standard alfalfa establishment soil condition. We did a soil dislodgement trial. I worked on this project with my colleague Chelsea Zegler, and we put soil mats on these three treatments. And we were trying to get a look at what is the impact um, of mitigating that risk of that raindrop from hitting that bare surface of the soil. So we know there's a tremendous impact and or force, I should say, of that raindrop when it hits bare soil. But like, how do we even measure that? So we put these mats out for 14 days, accumulated an inch and a half of rain during that time period, and then we were able to measure, how much soil was splashed up onto these mats. And here is the results. This was replicated data, but then it was averaged and put onto this graph. All right, so in our planting green setting, we had substantially less soil that was dislodged. So we did not have soil that was splashing, from the raindrop impact and getting up onto that mat. No-till was still pretty decent, but where we did that pretty light tillage just with the cultimulch tool, we had a tremendous amount of soil that was loosened from soil aggregates and splashed up onto that soil mat. Not to say that that soil, left the field, but it entered kind of that first stage of soil erosion, breaking apart from the soil aggregate where it was being held. A couple looks here at the data that, or excuse me, the sites that we had. And this is actually at the end of the season in 2022. I wanted to include these pictures as just a reminder of, how good alfalfa establishment was, even across all of the treatments there at Lancaster. We had six different rows you can see, and the establishment was very uniform across all the treatments. And again, the same thing at the Belmont on-farm site. It was nearly impossible to see where those treatment boundaries were by the end of the year. Okay, a little bit of data. First on the yield side, and this is at the Belmont on-farm site, and this is four replicates of each treatment on average. Okay, so the average of those four replicates. And one thing that is pretty consistent for the data for the plots that we've done is when we add cereal rye, we do have a reduction in that first alfalfa harvest. All right, so you can see on the far left we have no rye plus a glyphosate, termination just of any weeds that were there, and we're comparing that to the other three treatments. And we did have a reduction in total yield of that alfalfa harvest, following that first cereal rye harvest. Some of that is the timing and the age of the alfalfa, and that no rye plot didn't have anything else growing there with it, and really didn't have anything harvested, earlier. Whereas when we harvested the rye, we probably set the alfalfa back a little bit. But just want to put that out there. If our goal is maximum alfalfa yield in that first cutting, we are going to take just a little bit of hit with having this cereal rye in the system. On a
Here,
qual
Josh.
Thank you. On a quality side, when we have the cereal rye, that regrowth in there, we did notice a little bit of an impact on our forage quality as well. So that you can see that in the second graph. We had a little bit of a reduction in both protein and relative feed value. Would I guess suggest, if quality is really the number one goal, maybe having a herbicide pass in there to terminate any of the regrowing alfalfa might be a good choice. You can see in that third treatment there with rye harvest with, or excuse me, rye with glyphosate. We had quite a bit higher quality in that treatment. Just a few pictures here to round off the time that I have left. This is June of 2023 in the on-farm trial in Belmont. I'm just asking you to look at these pictures in June and then, think about what they might look like 2 months later. I was really shocked actually with 2023 being so dry. I really thought that 2x rye, so that'd been 120 pounds of rye. I did not know if that plot was going to recover, but it did by August. Again, with our rye forage harvest plots, they look pretty thin in June, but they both recovered well by August. Maybe a little bit more weed control where we had the glyphosate treatment in the field. Okay, the last graph that I have, this is from 2023. This is from last year. So this is actually the second cut. All right, so we took a look at that first cutting and we saw we did have a little bit of yield reduction there, where we had rye and where we didn't. We are still seeing just a little bit in the second cutting as well. Quite a bit less though. It really starts to even out by that second cutting regardless of the treatment that we choose. But one thing to keep in mind is we are noticing, there's a little bit of a reduction in alfalfa in that establishment year. Establishment success has been great, and we have the benefits that I shared too with having that companion cereal rye crop there early on. Okay, quickly to finish up, I'd like to thank the staff at Lancaster, Promised Land Farm in Belmont, Ryan Temperley, Greg O'Grady, and Dan Smith. My contact information is at the bottom, and I'll hang on if there's any questions. Thank you very much.